All right. Well, thanks everyone. This is it's really interesting in the context of purity. You know, what does a pure internet mean? Because it very well means very different things to different people. So, let's do it. I'm, by the way, Bill Ottman. I'm a fellow of Boston Global Forum, and I'm also the co-founder of Minds.com. So there's the internet. Keep going. All right, so to me, a pure internet is a free and open source infrastructure. And so this is the stack of the internet. So we have the bandwidth, the information, the data, the software, the hardware, the encryption, and the energy source that is actually powering the internet. So we're seeing open source software start to take over as especially dominant in the private sector, but slowly entering public. We have 11 nations who have adopted some sort of open source policy, meaning that they're using software that they don't necessarily have to buy for millions of dollars or be reliant on a third party to support it. India just has adopted an open source policy for a lot of their infrastructure. The US has some policies. For instance, whitehouse.gov is using Drupal, and there's some data sharing going on, but the fact is that we have tools now to be sharing so much more data that is publicly funded, so much more technology that's publicly funded, and we're obviously only in the very beginning stages. So 11 nations, we have hundreds of nations. Every nation needs to be participating in free and open source infrastructure. So open source creates software worth billions of dollars. We all know about Linux. Linux is becoming GNU/Linux is becoming the predominant operating system powering servers and people's personal computers all over the world. Open source encryption doesn't mean, just because something is transparent doesn't mean that it is compromising security. This is sort of a misperception. Gov.uk, open source, it's an example of soft power, which we were talking about a lot at the last conference. When you are transparent, it makes the world respect you, generally speaking. All right, next slide. So closed source proprietary infrastructure. When you don't have access to the source code, you can't inspect it for backdoors or security vulnerabilities. Like I said, you're relying on third parties for support and development. I know personal instances of the US government taking out multi-million-dollar contracts for security software and actually never really used it, and then they were reliant on that third party for support because they couldn't themselves inspect the code that they bought. It limits innovation. The beauty of open source is that, and free software, is that the whole world is able to develop it in a collaborative way. You don't have rights to the technology, and proprietary encryption cannot be proved to be truly secure. Next. So in terms of access to bandwidth, access to the internet itself, this is a great quote from a friend and advisor of mine, Eben Moglen. What free bandwidth means is that we ought to have a right to communicate equally using the electromagnetic spectrum that belongs to all of us. Instead, governments pretend that they own it, or Mr. Murdoch owns it, Mr. Berlusconi, or the Deutsche Telekom owns it. The result is that we pay to be connected to one another's minds. And that means we can only be as connected as we can afford, which means that poor people and people who are disfavored in societies in which they live don't have the ability to speak, and we need to change that. Eben Moglen. He works at the Software Freedom Law Center and was one of the creators of the General Public License, which is the most common free software license used all throughout the world. Free software. What is free software? Free software means software that respects users' freedom and community. Roughly, it means that users have the freedom to run, copy, distribute, study, change, and improve the software. Thus, free software is a matter of liberty, not price. To understand the concept, you should think of free as in free speech, not as in free beer. We sometimes call it Libre software to show that we do not mean it is gratis. This is a little bit of the confusion of language in the free software world, but people mistake free in thinking that it means price, but it's actually a matter of liberty. Free hardware. So these are the different layers: software, hardware, bandwidth. Free hardware, the actual data centers that are powering our global infrastructure. Open hardware or open source hardware refers to design specifications of a physical object which are licensed in such a way that said object can be studied, modified, created, and distributed by anyone. Even for the safety of our own government's infrastructure, if we don't have access to inspect it, we're buying those devices from third parties that could have access. So from any country's national security perspective, it matters to have greater access. Encryption. There's a new UN report out that says encryption tech is crucial for human rights, along with the right to anonymity. Obviously, there are two sides to this conversation, because certain amounts of surveillance are necessary for good reason, but also when you compromise encryption, you're compromising the security of everybody, not just the people that you're trying to gain access to. When we were here the other week, we went to MIT and checked out their new report called Keys Under Doormats, mandating insecurity by requiring government access to all data and communications. Bruce Schneier, who we talked with earlier, has been a huge proponent, saying that open source cryptography is essential for good security. The US government actually increases its funding for Tor, giving it $1.8 million. This is somewhat of a paradox, because Tor is a privacy tool that people all over the world use to maintain anonymity online. We have certain parts of the US government who are saying that we need to compromise encryption, but then meanwhile, the US government is also partially funding Tor. So it's just a really interesting conversation. Let's Encrypt is a campaign that's being backed by dozens of corporations and nonprofits that is trying to give everyone HTTPS for free. We have to get HTTPS going on the Boston Global Forum website ASAP. Next. Open source encryption. In the cryptography world, we consider open source necessary for good security. We have for decades. Public security is always more secure than proprietary security. It's true for cryptographic algorithms, security protocols, and security source code. For us, open source isn't just a business model, it's smart engineering practice. Freedom of information. So 95 countries around the world have implemented some form of freedom of information legislation. There's a new FOIA bill going through, well, that may go through, called the Oversight and Implementation Act of 2015. Open data, so Creative Commons and other open licensing options are really important for governments, individuals to be aware of. Most people don't even understand that the content that we're uploading online can be given a variety of licenses. When you upload your content to Facebook or YouTube or wherever, what is that license? Who controls it? What rights are you giving away? Would it not be better to have greater degree of control over the future of your data? Reforming whistleblower laws, transparency increases security. There's freedom of information is really at the root of security worldwide, because when it's just that paradox that needs to be revolved around. You think that the more secret you are, the more secure you are, but really that isn't the way that we participate in public forums. The beauty of being able to have a public forum like this is to talk about the issues, be fully transparent about what you're saying, and that is how we move forward. Next. And then finally, we have what powers the internet. What is actually pure? The data centers are consuming some of the most energy of any industry in the world. And the source of that energy is often very impure. So when we're talking about a free internet, a clean internet, a pure internet, we obviously have to be powering it with renewable energy. Microsoft, Apple, and Google are doing so, but I think we still need to do much better. I do not agree with what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. Evelyn Beatrice Hall. All right, thanks everybody very much. I look forward to talking more.